Peter was broken, but God rebuilt him for war. There is a moment in every believer's life when confidence collapses. A moment when the person you thought you were dies, and the person God is shaping begins to emerge from the ruins. It is a moment of unbearable silence, where heaven seems distant, prayers feel weak, and your own reflection becomes a stranger to you. This moment is not the end. It is the beginning of transformation, and no one embodies this painful, sacred process more than Peter. Peter was not weak by nature. He was bold, impulsive, passionate, and fiercely loyal. He was the man who stepped out of the boat while others stayed frozen in fear. He was the one who declared without hesitation that Jesus was the Son of the living God. He was the one who swore he would die before ever abandoning his Lord. He believed his strength was enough. He believed his loyalty was unbreakable. He believed his love alone would carry him through the coming storm. But God knew something Peter did not yet understand. Peter's strength was incomplete. His courage was real, but it was still human. His loyalty was sincere, but it had not yet been tested by fire. And before Peter could become a warrior for the kingdom, he had to be broken. Because God does not send unbroken men into spiritual war. God does not build his kingdom on human confidence. He builds it on surrendered hearts. He does not choose those who trust their own strength. He chooses those who have learned they have none without him. Peter's breaking was not punishment. It was preparation. What looked like failure was actually construction. What felt like abandonment was actually positioning. What seemed like the end of Peter's purpose was actually the beginning of his true calling. God was not destroying Peter. God was rebuilding him, because the man who would stand before rulers without fear, the man who would endure prison without trembling, the man who would face death without denial, could not be the same man who once relied on his own courage. He had to become someone new. And that transformation began in the place where Peter lost everything he believed about himself. This is the story of how God breaks his warriors, not to destroy them, but to rebuild them for war. The confidence that had to be shattered. Peter's confidence was not fake. It was real. It was passionate. It was loud. It was visible. When others hesitated, Peter stepped forward. When others stayed silent, Peter spoke. When others questioned, Peter declared. He was not a coward pretending to be brave. He was brave. But his bravery had not yet faced the darkness that reveals the limits of human strength. In Matthew 26:33, Peter said words that seemed noble, words that sounded like the ultimate declaration of loyalty. Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. This was not arrogance in Peter's mind. This was certainty. He believed he knew himself. He believed he understood his own limits. He believed his devotion was stronger than fear. But Jesus answered him with words that cut deeper than any sword. Truly I tell you, Jesus said, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Matthew 26:34. Peter could not accept this reality. It did not match his identity. It did not align with how he saw himself. He could imagine others failing. He could imagine others running, but not himself. Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you, Peter replied. Matthew 26:35. These words reveal something critical. Peter trusted Peter more than he trusted Jesus' warning. This is the first stage of breaking. It is when God allows you to believe in your own strength long enough to reveal its limits. God does not immediately destroy human confidence. He allows it to stand until the moment comes when reality exposes its fragility, because warriors who trust themselves will collapse in battle. God must teach them to trust him instead. Peter's confidence had to be shattered, not because confidence itself is wrong, but because confidence in self cannot survive spiritual war. The battlefield Peter was about to enter was not physical. It was spiritual, it was psychological, it was internal, it was the war between fear and faith, between flesh and spirit, between instinct and obedience. And Peter did not yet understand how strong fear could be. When Jesus was arrested, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The boldness that existed when Jesus stood beside them disappeared the moment soldiers surrounded him. Everything changed. The man Peter had sworn to die for was now bound like a criminal. The one who had walked on water, healed the blind, raised the dead and commanded storms, now stood silent before human authority. And suddenly, Peter was no longer standing beside power. He was standing beside vulnerability. This is where many believers first encounter their breaking point. It is easy to be bold when God's power feels visible. It is easy to be confident when His presence feels obvious. It is easy to speak loudly when miracles surround you. But what happens when God appears silent? What happens when heaven does not intervene the way you expected? What happens when faith suddenly costs something real? Peter followed Jesus at a distance, Luke 22:54. This small detail reveals everything. He did not run away completely. He did not abandon Jesus entirely. But he was no longer standing close. Distance is the first symptom of fear. Fear does not always make you leave immediately. Sometimes it makes you step back slowly. You still believe. You still care. You still watch. But you are no longer standing where you once stood. Peter found himself in the courtyard, surrounded not by disciples, but by strangers, by servants, by people who had no loyalty to Jesus, by people who were watching. And then it happened. A servant girl looked at him and said, "This man was with him." Luke 22:56. This was not a soldier, not a judge, not a king, just a servant girl, and yet Peter denied it. "Woman, I do not know him," he said. Luke 22:57. The words came out of his mouth before he could stop them. This is the reality of fear. Fear bypasses logic. Fear overrides intention. Fear exposes the difference between who you believe you are and who you truly are under pressure. Peter had promised to die with Jesus, but he could not even admit knowing him. This was not because Peter did not love Jesus. It was because Peter was human. And God needed Peter to see that. Because only broken men can become spiritual warriors. Unbroken men still trust themselves. Broken men trust God. Peter denied Jesus again and again. 3 times he chose survival over loyalty. 3 times he chose safety over truth. 3 times he became someone he never imagined he could become. And then the rooster crowed. Luke 22:61 reveals one of the most devastating moments in Scripture. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. No words were spoken. None were needed. That look carried everything. It carried truth. It carried exposure. It carried sorrow. It carried love. It carried understanding. In that moment, Peter saw himself clearly for the first time. Not the version of himself he believed in, not the version of himself he presented to others, but the truth. He was not as strong as he thought. He was not as fearless as he believed. He was not as unbreakable as he imagined. And Luke 22:62 says, "And he went outside and wept bitterly." This was the moment Peter broke. This was the death of his old identity. This was the collapse of his self-confidence. This was the destruction of the illusion he had built about himself. But this breaking was not the end. This was the beginning of his reconstruction. Because God was not looking for a man who believed he would never fall. God was looking for a man who knew exactly what it meant to fall, and who knew exactly who had lifted him back up. Peter's tears were not weakness. They were the foundation of strength, because spiritual warriors are not those who never fall. They are those who have fallen, been rebuilt by God, and no longer trust themselves, but trust the one who rebuilt them. Peter did not yet know it, but God was preparing him. God was not finished with him. God was transforming him. The man who denied Jesus would become the man who would proclaim him without fear. The man who broke in fear would become the man who would stand unshaken before death. But first, Peter had to lose faith in himself, so he could gain unbreakable faith in God. Peter's breaking did not end with his tears. The tears were only the visible sign of something much deeper happening inside him. Something invisible had collapsed. Something foundational had been exposed. For years, Peter believed his devotion was his strength. He believed his love for Jesus was enough to sustain him through anything. He believed that because he felt bold, he was unbreakable. But the courtyard revealed the truth that God already knew. Human devotion, no matter how sincere, cannot withstand spiritual war without divine transformation. This is the painful truth every warrior must eventually face. Passion alone is not enough. Emotion alone is not enough. Intentions alone are not enough. Because spiritual war does not attack your intentions. It attacks your identity. It attacks your certainty. It attacks the very core of who you believe you are. And when that core is built on self-confidence instead of divine dependence, it will collapse under pressure. Peter's collapse was not random. It was not accidental. It was permitted. Jesus had already told Peter it would happen, not to shame him, not to condemn him, but to prepare him for what would come after. Because God does not waste breaking, God uses breaking to remove illusions. Peter had an illusion about himself. He believed he was the strongest. He believed he was the most loyal. He believed he would be the last to fall. But that illusion was dangerous. Because warriors who believe they cannot fall are the most vulnerable to falling. Pride creates blind spots, and blind spots create weakness. God had to remove Peter's illusion of strength so he could replace it with something real, something eternal, something unshakable. Not confidence in self, but confidence in God. This is why Jesus said something extraordinary to Peter before his failure even happened. In Luke 22:31-32, Jesus said, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Jesus did not say if you turn back, he said when you turn back. This reveals something powerful. Jesus already knew Peter would fall, but he also knew Peter would rise. Because Peter's fall was not his destruction, it was his transformation. Satan wanted to sift Peter. Sifting is a violent process. It separates, it shakes, it exposes. It removes what is loose and reveals what is solid. Satan wanted to destroy Peter's faith, but God used the sifting to purify it. This is the difference between the enemy's intention and God's purpose. The enemy wants to break you so you never rise again. God allows breaking so you rise stronger than before. The same event can serve two different purposes. Satan wanted Peter to see his failure and believe he was unworthy forever. God wanted Peter to see his failure and understand he must never rely on himself again. This is why brokenness is essential for spiritual warriors. Because warriors who have never been broken still trust their own strength, and self-trust is unstable. It shifts with circumstances. It rises with success and collapses with failure. But warriors rebuilt by God trust something unchanging. They trust the one who never fails. After Peter denied Jesus, something inside him died. The version of himself he believed in was gone. He could no longer claim he would never fall. He could no longer claim he was stronger than others. He had seen the truth. And truth is painful when it exposes weakness. But truth is also the foundation of transformation. Because you cannot become who God is calling you to be until you stop pretending to be someone you are not. Peter had to stop believing he was unbreakable so God could make him unshakable. These two things are not the same. Being unbreakable is an illusion of human strength. Being unshakable is the result of divine reconstruction. Unbreakable means you believe nothing can hurt you. Unshakable means even when you are hurt, you do not collapse. Unbreakable depends on avoiding failure. Unshakable is built through surviving failure. God was not trying to preserve Peter's image of himself. God was trying to build Peter into something greater, something eternal, something fearless. But fearlessness cannot exist until fear has been faced. Peter had never faced fear like this before. He had faced storms. He had faced uncertainty. He had faced the unknown. But he had never faced the possibility of losing everything. He had never faced the reality of standing alone without Jesus beside him physically. This is where true breaking begins. When God allows you to stand in a moment where everything familiar disappears, where the comfort you relied on is gone, where the strength you believed in fails you, where you see clearly that without him you are nothing. This is not cruelty. This is construction. Because God does not build warriors on illusions, he builds them on truth, and truth often begins in breaking. Peter's tears were not the end of his story. They were the beginning of his rebuilding. But at that moment, Peter did not know that. At that moment, all he knew was pain. All he knew was regret. All he knew was that he had failed the one he loved most. This kind of pain is different from ordinary pain. It is not physical. It is spiritual. It is the pain of seeing yourself clearly. It is the pain of knowing you are not who you thought you were. It is the pain of realizing your strength was never enough. This pain humbles you. It removes pride. It removes illusion. It removes false identity. And in that empty space, God begins to build something new. Because God cannot rebuild what you refuse to release. Peter had to release his self-confidence so God could give him divine confidence. He had to release his illusion of strength so God could give him true strength. He had to release his identity as a loyal follower so he could become a fearless leader. This process is not instant. It is not comfortable. It is not easy. But it is necessary because spiritual war requires more than courage. It requires transformation. It requires the death of the old self and the birth of a new identity. Peter's denial marked the death of his old identity. The man who believed he was unbreakable was gone, and in his place, God would build a man who could stand before kings without trembling. But first, Peter had to live in the silence of his failure. He had to sit in the reality of what he had done. He had to feel the weight of his weakness, because this weight would become the foundation of his strength. Warriors who have never faced their weakness remain vulnerable to it. But warriors who have faced their weakness and survived it become dangerous to the enemy, because they no longer trust themselves, they trust God. And trust in God creates unshakable strength. Peter did not yet understand that his breaking was part of his calling. He believed he had disqualified himself. He believed he had lost his place. He believed he had failed beyond repair. This is exactly where the enemy wanted him. Because the enemy's greatest weapon is not failure. It is the belief that failure is final. But God does not see failure the way humans do. Humans see failure as an ending. God sees it as a beginning. Because failure reveals truth, and truth creates transformation. Peter's breaking was not proof that he was weak beyond use. It was proof that he was ready to be rebuilt, because only broken men can be rebuilt into spiritual warriors. Only those who know their weakness can carry divine strength. Only those who have fallen and risen again can stand unshaken in spiritual war. Peter's tears were the soil where his new identity would grow. The man who wept outside the courtyard was not the same man who had walked inside it. Something had changed. Something had died. And something new was beginning, even if Peter could not yet see it. God was not finished with Peter. God was preparing him. God was rebuilding him. And the warrior Peter would become would be stronger, not because he never fell, but because he had fallen and been rebuilt by God himself. Peter disappeared into the shadows of his own shame. The noise of the courtyard faded behind him, but the sound of the rooster did not fade from his mind. It echoed inside him again and again, not as a sound, but as a revelation. Every step he took away from that place felt heavier than the last. He was no longer running from soldiers, he was running from himself. Because the greatest battlefield Peter had entered was not the courtyard, it was his own soul. He had seen something he could not unsee. He had seen the gap between who he believed he was and who he truly was when tested. This is the moment where many are lost forever, not because God abandons them, but because they abandon themselves. Shame has a unique power. It isolates. It convinces you that you are alone in your failure. It whispers lies that say you are finished, disqualified, beyond restoration. Shame does not only remind you of what you did, it tries to redefine who you are. Peter was no longer just a man who had denied Jesus. In his mind, he was a coward. He was a failure. He was weak. The enemy wanted Peter to believe this was his final identity, because if Peter believed he was permanently broken, he would never discover he was being rebuilt. This is how spiritual warfare often works. The enemy does not need to destroy your body if he can convince you that your spirit is beyond repair. He does not need to imprison you physically if he can imprison your mind in shame. Peter had entered this prison, not made of walls, but made of regret. Every memory of Jesus' words now felt like a blade. Every moment of confidence now felt like a lie. Every promise he made now felt like proof of his weakness. He remembered saying he would die with Jesus, and yet he had not even stood beside him. He remembered walking on water toward Jesus, and yet he had now drowned in fear without ever touching the sea. This contradiction shattered him because it forced him to confront a truth he never wanted to face. He was capable of failing God. This realization breaks something fundamental inside a person, because many believers build their identity on the idea that their loyalty will never waver. But loyalty built on human strength always has limits. God needed Peter to see those limits clearly, not to destroy him, but to free him from trusting in himself, because as long as Peter believed his strength came from himself, he would never discover the limitless strength that comes from God. Peter's silence after his denial was not just grief, it was the death of self-reliance. This death is necessary, because God does not share his throne with human pride. He does not build his warriors on the foundation of self-confidence. He builds them on the foundation of surrender. Peter had to surrender the belief that he could carry himself. He had to surrender the belief that his love alone made him strong. He had to surrender the illusion that he was different from other men. Because spiritual warriors are not those who believe they cannot fall. They are those who know they can fall and trust God to hold them. This is the paradox of divine strength. It is given most fully to those who know they are weak. The world teaches you to hide your weakness. God exposes it so he can replace it. The world teaches you to appear strong. God breaks you so you can become unshakable. Peter did not yet understand that his breaking was part of his appointment. He believed he had missed his destiny. He believed God would choose someone else, someone stronger, someone more faithful, someone who would not fail. But God was not looking for someone who had never failed. God was looking for someone who had failed and been transformed by it. Because failure creates humility, and humility creates dependence on God, and dependence on God creates spiritual authority. Authority in the kingdom of God does not come from perfection, it comes from transformation. Peter's authority would not come from his boldness before the courtyard, it would come from his brokenness after it. Because brokenness removes pride, and pride is the greatest weakness a spiritual warrior can carry. Pride blinds you to your dependence on God. It convinces you that you are the source of your strength. But when pride dies, something greater is born. Dependence on God. And dependence on God creates warriors who cannot be defeated, because their strength no longer comes from themselves. It comes from Him. Peter was in this transition. He was no longer the confident man he once was, but he was not yet the fearless leader he would become. He was in between, in the silence, in the uncertainty, in the place where identity is stripped and rebuilt. This place is painful. It feels like abandonment. It feels like loss. It feels like death. But it is actually construction, because God does His deepest work in hidden places. He does not rebuild you in front of crowds. He rebuilds you in silence. He does not transform you in moments of applause. He transforms you in moments of isolation. Peter was being rebuilt in his silence. Every tear was washing away pride. Every moment of regret was breaking self-reliance. Every memory of failure was preparing him to trust God fully. This process cannot be rushed, because identity transformation requires the death of the old self. And death is not comfortable, but it is necessary for resurrection. Peter's old identity had to die so his true identity could rise. The man who trusted himself had to die so the man who trusted God completely could live. This is why God did not stop Peter from denying Him. Jesus could have intervened. He could have prevented the denial, but He did not, because prevention would have preserved Peter's illusion. And illusion cannot survive spiritual war. Truth is the only foundation strong enough to carry divine authority. Peter needed truth more than protection. He needed transformation more than comfort. He needed to become someone new. This is what God was doing, not abandoning Peter, rebuilding him, not rejecting Peter, refining him, not disqualifying Peter, preparing him. Because Peter's greatest strength would not come from never falling. It would come from rising after falling, rising with a new identity, rising with new dependence, rising with unshakable faith. The enemy believed Peter's story had ended in that courtyard, but heaven knew it had only begun. Because the man who had broken in fear would soon stand in power. The man who had denied Jesus would soon proclaim Him without hesitation. The man who had wept in shame would soon speak with authority that would shake nations. But this authority was being built in the ashes of his failure, because God builds His strongest warriors from the ruins of their weakest moments. Peter was no longer the man he thought he was, but he was becoming the man God had always planned him to be. And that man would be unstoppable, not because he was perfect, but because he had been broken, rebuilt, and filled with strength that did not come from himself, but from God alone. Peter now lived in a reality he had never imagined. The man who once walked beside Jesus with bold certainty now walked alone with silent questions. Every memory of Jesus' voice replayed in his mind, but now those memories felt distant, like echoes from a life that no longer belonged to him. This is one of the most painful stages of divine reconstruction. It is the stage where God removes your former identity, but has not yet revealed your new one. You are no longer who you were, but you do not yet know who you are becoming. This in-between place feels like exile. It feels like standing between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Peter could not return to who he had been before Jesus, because he had seen too much, experienced too much, known too much. But he also did not feel worthy to stand as a leader among the disciples anymore, because he had failed in the moment that mattered most. This is the wilderness of identity, and wilderness is where God transforms His warriors. The wilderness strips away illusions. It removes distractions. It forces confrontation with truth. It is not a place of punishment. It is a place of preparation. Every warrior in Scripture passes through wilderness before stepping into authority. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before confronting Pharaoh. David spent years fleeing in the wilderness before becoming king. Jesus himself spent 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his ministry. And now Peter entered his own wilderness, not of sand and desert, but of silence and shame. The silence was unbearable, because silence forces you to face yourself without distraction. There were no crowds now, no miracles, no moments of bold declaration, only memory, only truth, only reflection. Peter had to confront the reality that his confidence had been fragile. He had to accept that his courage had limits. He had to face the truth that he was capable of abandoning the one he loved most. This confrontation is necessary, because God cannot rebuild what you refuse to acknowledge. Denial prevents transformation, but acceptance creates space for reconstruction. Peter was no longer denying his weakness. He had seen it clearly. He had felt it completely. And this acceptance was the first step toward becoming unshakable, because warriors who know their weakness cannot be deceived by pride. Pride whispers lies of invincibility. But Peter now knew he was not invincible. And this knowledge became protection, because spiritual strength does not come from believing you cannot fall. It comes from knowing that without God, you will. This realization creates dependence, and dependence creates unbreakable connection with divine strength. But Peter did not yet feel strong. He felt empty. Emptiness is terrifying because it feels like loss. But emptiness is also necessary because God fills empty vessels. Full vessels cannot receive more. They are already occupied, but empty vessels are ready to be filled with something new. God had emptied Peter of self-reliance. Now he would fill him with divine authority. But this filling would not happen instantly, because God was not only changing Peter's strength, he was changing Peter's identity. Identity transformation requires time. It requires reflection. It requires surrender. It requires the death of the old self and the birth of the new. Peter's old identity was built on being the strongest disciple, the boldest voice, the fearless one. But that identity had collapsed. Now God would build a new identity, not based on Peter's perception of himself, but based on God's purpose for him. This identity would not depend on emotion. It would not depend on confidence. It would depend on calling. Calling is different from confidence. Confidence can rise and fall with circumstances. Calling remains, even when confidence dies. Peter's calling had not changed, but Peter himself had to change to carry it, because calling requires capacity, and capacity is built through breaking. Breaking expands you. It removes what is weak. It exposes what is unstable. It forces growth. It forces transformation. Peter's breaking was expanding his capacity to carry authority, because authority without humility becomes pride, and pride destroys spiritual warriors. God was protecting Peter from becoming a leader who trusted himself more than God, because leaders who trust themselves eventually collapse. But leaders who trust God remain unshaken. Peter's silence was not abandonment. It was preparation. God was working in the unseen places of his heart, removing pride, removing illusion, removing self-dependence, and replacing it with something stronger, something eternal, something unshakable. Peter could not feel it yet, but reconstruction had begun. This is how God works. He rebuilds you before you realize it. He transforms you beneath the surface. He strengthens you in hidden places, because true strength is not visible at first. It develops in silence. It grows in surrender. It emerges through breaking. Peter's tears had softened his heart, and softened hearts can receive divine strength. Hardened hearts resist transformation, but broken hearts are open. Open to change, open to growth, open to God. This openness would become Peter's greatest strength, because spiritual authority flows through surrendered vessels, not through those who believe they are already strong. Peter was becoming surrendered, not by choice at first, but through breaking. But this surrender would soon become his greatest weapon, because surrendered warriors cannot be controlled by fear. Fear controls those who trust themselves, but those who trust God become fearless. because their security no longer depends on their own strength. It depends on His. Peter had not yet reached this place fully, but he was moving toward it. Every moment of reflection was shaping him. Every moment of silence was strengthening him. Every moment of humility was preparing him, because God was not finished. The breaking had occurred, but the rebuilding was underway, and the man who would emerge from this process would be completely different from the man who had entered the courtyard. The new Peter would not rely on emotion. He would rely on God. He would not trust his courage. He would trust God's presence. He would not speak from confidence in himself. He would speak from authority given by God. This is the difference between natural strength and divine strength. Natural strength collapses under pressure. Divine strength grows stronger through pressure. Peter was being transformed from natural strength into divine strength. And once this transformation was complete, nothing would be able to stop him, because warriors rebuilt by God cannot be defeated by fear. They have already faced their greatest weakness and survived. They have already been broken and rebuilt. They no longer fear breaking because they know breaking leads to strengthening. Peter's story was not over. It was only beginning. The man who had wept in darkness would soon stand in light. The man who had denied Jesus in fear would soon proclaim him with unshakable authority. But that authority was being built now, in silence, in surrender, in breaking, and God was preparing Peter for war. The silence that surrounded Peter was heavier than any chain. There were no accusations spoken to him now, no crowds confronting him, no servant pointing a finger. And yet, the absence of external voices only amplified the internal ones. The human mind, when left alone with failure, becomes its own battlefield. Every moment replays, every word returns, every decision is examined under the harsh light of regret. Peter could still see the fire in the courtyard. He could still feel the cold air against his skin. He could still hear his own voice saying the words he never thought he would say, "I do not know him." These words did not just deny Jesus. They shattered Peter's perception of himself, because Peter had always believed his love for Jesus defined him. And now he had to confront the truth that love alone, without transformation, could still collapse under fear. This realization destroys something deep within a person, because it reveals that intention is not the same as endurance. Many intend to remain faithful, many believe they will stand firm, but intention alone cannot withstand spiritual war. Endurance is not built through promises, it is built through transformation. Peter had promised loyalty, but now God would build endurance. This is the difference between human devotion and divine strength. Human devotion is sincere but fragile. Divine strength is unshakable because it does not originate from human emotion. It originates from God Himself. Peter was now standing at the threshold of this transformation. But transformation always begins in discomfort, because comfort preserves the old identity. Discomfort forces the birth of the new. Peter could no longer find comfort in who he had been. The identity of the bold disciple was gone. The identity of the fearless follower had collapsed. And in its place was emptiness. This emptiness is terrifying because identity defines how you see yourself. Without identity, you feel lost. Without identity, you feel exposed. Without identity, you feel weak. But God uses this exact moment to rebuild you according to His design, not your perception. Because your perception of yourself is limited by your human understanding. God's design for you is not limited by your past failures. It is defined by His purpose. Peter's purpose had never changed. Even when Peter failed, his calling remained. This is one of the greatest truths in spiritual warfare. Failure does not cancel calling, but failure changes the vessel that carries it. The vessel must be reshaped, strengthened, purified, because calling requires capacity, and capacity is built through breaking. Peter had to be emptied of self-reliance so he could be filled with divine authority. This filling does not occur instantly. It occurs through process. Process creates endurance, and endurance creates warriors. Warriors are not made in moments of victory. They are made in seasons of breaking, because breaking removes illusion, and illusion is the greatest enemy of spiritual authority. Illusion convinces you that you are strong when you are not. Illusion convinces you that your strength belongs to you. But breaking reveals the truth. Your strength was never yours. It was always God sustaining you. Peter had experienced God's power many times before. He had walked on water. He had witnessed miracles. He had seen the impossible become possible. But he had not yet learned dependence, because it is possible to witness divine power without fully depending on it. Peter believed in Jesus, but he had not yet fully surrendered his identity to him. This surrender would now occur, not through teaching, but through breaking. Breaking teaches lessons that words cannot. Breaking removes pride. Breaking removes illusion. Breaking removes the belief that you are self-sufficient. And once self-sufficiency dies, dependence on God is born. This dependence is the foundation of spiritual authority. Authority does not come from confidence in yourself. It comes from surrender to God. Peter was learning this lesson in silence, and silence is one of God's most powerful tools, because silence forces reflection. It forces honesty. It forces confrontation with truth. There were no distractions now, no miracles to witness, no crowds to follow, only the reality of his own weakness. But weakness, when surrendered to God, becomes strength. This is the paradox of divine transformation. God does not eliminate weakness. He transforms it into strength by removing self-dependence. Peter's weakness had exposed the limits of his human strength. But now God would build divine strength in its place. This divine strength would not be based on emotion. It would not be based on confidence. It would not be based on personality. It would be based on surrender. Surrender creates stability, because surrendered warriors no longer trust themselves. They trust God. And trust in God cannot be shaken by fear. Fear loses power when you no longer depend on your own ability, because fear attacks your ability, but it cannot attack God's. Peter was being prepared for a level of authority that required complete dependence, because the battles he would face would not be physical, they would be spiritual. He would stand before rulers who could order his death. He would face persecution designed to silence him. He would confront forces that would try to break him again. But the new Peter would not break, because the new Peter would not rely on himself. He would rely on God. This reliance would make him unstoppable, not because he was fearless by nature, but because he had learned that God sustains those who surrender fully. Peter's breaking had destroyed his illusion of independence, and this destruction was necessary. Because independence from God is the greatest vulnerability a spiritual warrior can have, dependence on God is the greatest strength. Peter's tears had begun this transition. His silence was continuing it. His identity was being reshaped. And though he did not yet understand it fully, God was rebuilding him into something far greater than he had ever imagined. The man who had once relied on his own courage would soon operate with divine authority. The man who had once feared being recognized would soon speak publicly without hesitation. The man who had once denied Jesus would soon declare him boldly before the world. But that declaration would not come from human confidence. It would come from divine transformation. Because Peter was no longer being built by his own belief in himself, he was being rebuilt by God. And warriors rebuilt by God cannot be broken by fear again.